Strategic Petroleum Reserve. What does that say about our relations with, say, an Iran? And does it put Iran on the ropes a little bit? Because you saw the fight that erupted in OPEC, but does that put them at least some sort of short-term disadvantage?
I don't really think so. I think this release was entirely political. There's nothing nearly amounting to the kind of strategic crisis that the Petroleum Reserve was created for or that would justify a release. And I think the Saudis and others had made it clear that whatever the disruptions in Libyan production caused by the civil war there, they would make up. OPEC is often in disarray, and the Saudis and others have their own ways of just increasing production without regard to the quotas that OPEC agrees on. So I think this was actually a mistake. I think when you use the Petroleum Reserve in this kind of way, you're undercutting its purpose and sending a signal of weakness when there's no need to do it.
Well, you know, it's interesting because the White House's case is that there is a supply problem, especially with what's gone on in Libya. Of course, a lot of the oil that comes out of Libya goes to Europe and not to the United States. But one of the things that we were talking about, Ambassador Bolton, and it's entirely possible, and we're kind of overthinking this, but it was brought up, the reason we were talking about it is because one of our guests, an oil analyst, brought it up, is that maybe there are other problems, supply problems, that are either already there or about to make themselves evident in other countries, whether it's Yemen or the Sudan. We already know about Libya, and this move is almost preemptive and not just purely political, as the initial analysis seems to be. But what do you make of that theory?
Well, if that's a theory, I don't think much of it. Yemen doesn't produce very much oil to begin with.
Right.
In Sudan, you do have difficulty because of the impending civil war there, but that's more of a Chinese problem than anything else. And as you look at Libya, production has come back on stream in the eastern part of the country, the ancient province of Cyrenaica, controlled by the opposition. And look, if there's an oil production problem worldwide, we can solve it in the United States without anybody's help by drilling more here. So I think the whole thing is entirely artificial. You know, that reserve was created basically for military purposes, for our fleets and for our Air Force and Army, if it looked like supplies would be tight internationally. And to use it for price adjustment purposes, I think is really contrary to the basic reason we set it up to begin with.
Mr. Ambassador, let's turn our attention to what's going on in Europe and Greece. And you wrote recently about the IMF. And when do you think America will truly wake up and, to paraphrase what you said, realize that the IMF does little or nothing for us?
Well, it's a surprise to me that we haven't already. You know, I proposed in that article that you mentioned that we basically abolish the IMF. That may sound radical, but I have to admit I stole that idea from former Secretary of the Treasury George Shultz, former Secretary of the Treasury, now deceased, Bill Simon, former chairman of Citigroup, Walter Wriston, hardly a group of radicals. The point is that with the end of the fixed exchange rate system and the adoption of floating exchange rates decades ago, the basic purpose of the IMF is ended. And as Secretary Shultz said, what the governments use the IMF for now is to do things that their own people wouldn't approve of if you asked them straight up. And I think the bailout of Greece and propping up the euro is exactly what Secretary Shultz was talking about.
And the internal politics are interesting. Even if you are right, and we all agree that you were right, the odds of something like the elimination of the IMF happening in the very near term seem to be remote, but you know, you never know what's going to happen. But that said, the current structure of it and who's going to take over for it, that's where it kind of gets interesting, because Christine Lagarde, as the French finance minister, seems to be the favorite, but it's always assumed that a European will lead the IMF, and it's almost self-serving, isn't it, in many ways? Because, as you say, that's basically been their main business here the last few years, is to bail out Europe. It looks like it will be for at least the foreseeable future.
Well, I think Christine Lagarde may be the last European head of the IMF. You know, she benefits because the developing countries don't have the voting weights in the IMF, and they're divided among themselves. They want somebody other than a European, but Brazilians want a Brazilian, Chinese want a Chinese, and so on. So I think the Mexican central bank governor is unlikely to prevail, but a third world person could do it next time. I mean, some say, well, we don't want to cross the Europeans because then we'll lose the presidency of the World Bank, which another Bretton Woods institution the United States has traditionally headed. I say, so be it. I think it's time to privatize the World Bank anyway.
Your reaction to the president's plan to start withdrawing troops from Afghanistan, beginning with 10,000. You're hearing from Mike Mullen, chairman of the Joint Chiefs, along with General Petraeus, suggesting that it seems to be too aggressive. Is it?
Oh, I think it's the wrong move. The only reason we're talking about withdrawing anybody now is because 18 months ago, when the president announced the surge, he said that in the summer of 2011, he'd start withdrawing troops, utterly unrelated to conditions on the ground in Afghanistan or whether we're achieving the objectives that we need to achieve there. You know, the more you read the president's speech from Wednesday night, the worse it gets. It really increasingly strikes me as the contemporary equivalent of George McGovern in 1972 saying, "Come home, America." This is a big mistake for the United States. It sends an enormous signal of weakness, not just in Afghanistan and Pakistan, but throughout the Middle East and around the world. It's just sad Republicans are now somewhat split on this issue because it's a real failure of presidential leadership.
And the criticism does come from both the left and the right of the president. And you're right, one of the more interesting developments is that some of that criticism from his left is coming not from Democrats, but from Republicans. And then you have somebody like you, Ambassador Bolton, who says, no. We need to stay in Afghanistan. We need to be more aggressive. Make that case for us, especially for those in your party who you might ordinarily agree with on other matters who are saying, now's the time to get out.
Look, the pole star for setting American national security policy is what's in our strategic interest, and we've got two interests in Afghanistan. One is preventing that country from again becoming a base for international terrorism under the control of Taliban or al-Qaeda or other Islamic radicals. Second, we must prevent instability there from spilling over into Pakistan and risk having that government fall to radicals and terrorists and putting a very substantial arsenal of nuclear weapons, 50, 60, 100 or more, into terrorist hands where they could be used on a worldwide basis. Have we been there a long time? Yes. How long were we in Europe after World War II fighting the Cold War? We're still there. We cannot look at this and say 10 years is too long. We've got to have attention spans that are sufficient to meet the threats that are posed against us. We didn't ask for this. We didn't ask to be attacked, but we need to do what we need to do to defend ourselves to make sure it doesn't happen again.
Ambassador John Bolton, former ambassador to the United Nations, with us here in Imus in the Morning and covering a lot of ground and a lot of different issues. The other big issue that we wanted to talk to you about has to be Libya. You know, it's been going on now for a while. It's tough to see what the end or how this ends, this conflict in Libya. There's a story I was just reading on the cover of the Wall Street Journal this morning that Muammar Gaddafi might flee Tripoli. I mean, how do you see this all winding itself up? What's the end game in Libya, and how close are we to it?
Well, I think we're actually fairly close. I have nothing good to say about President Obama's conduct of this intervention. He went in for the wrong reason. He's led very poorly. It's a real example of presidential incompetence in national security affairs. But to come back to that poll star, there is an American strategic interest in removing Gaddafi from power ever since he threatened to return to international terrorism. Had the president acted swiftly and decisively 3 months ago, I think this thing would nearly be over by now, and I think we're very close to achieving the correct objective, no thanks to the president's leadership. So today in the House, there are going to be several votes on what to do. I think the Republicans ought to suck it up and do the right thing, even though it's frustrating and unfair that we're carrying the president's water for him. We've got to do the right thing for the country, and that's authorize this operation to continue.